Hey guys, thanks for clicking in. Tonight we dive into the wild roller coaster life of Bonnie and Clyde, their childhoods, their love life, and their crime spree. We cover it all. But before we begin, if you enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place and let's get started. In the depths of the Great Depression, when banks fell and breadlines stretched for miles, a young man and woman carved their names into history with bullets and blood. They weren't heroes, but they weren't quite villains either. To some, they were reckless criminals. To others, they were folk legends, thumbing their noses at a system that had already failed them. Their love story was written in stolen cars, smuggled guns, and headlines that screamed their names. But every legend has a cost, and for Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the ending was inevitable. This is the insane life of Bonnie and Clyde. Long before they became outlaws, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were just two kids growing up in the shadow of hard times. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in 1909, the fifth of 7 children in a poor Texas farming family. His parents, tenant farmers, struggled to make ends meet, moving from one patch of dirt to the next. By the time Clyde was a teenager, the family had traded the countryside for the rough edges of West Dallas, a neighborhood so poor it was nicknamed the Devil's Back Porch. It was there, among the dust, shacks, and railroad tracks, that Clyde learned the art of survival. He wasn't born a criminal, but the Great Depression left plenty of doors closed to young men like him, and a few windows temptingly open. By his late teens, he'd already been arrested for stealing turkeys and cars, and he'd developed a taste for fast getaways. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker, born in 1910, had a childhood shaped by both tragedy and ambition. She grew up in Rowena, Texas, until her father died when she was just 4 years old. Her mother moved the family to the industrial outskirts of Dallas, where Bonnie was known for her sharp wit, flair for writing poetry, and a burning desire to be something more than just another country girl from the wrong side of town. She was petite, stylish, and adored attention, but underneath, there was a restlessness that couldn't be quieted. At 16, she married a man named Roy Thornton, but the marriage was turbulent, and within a few years, he was gone, leaving behind only a ring she never took off, even after meeting Clyde. Their worlds collided in January of 1930. The story goes that Clyde came over to a friend's house, and Bonnie, in the kitchen making hot chocolate, caught his eye immediately. He was lean, handsome, and had quite confidence. She was magnetic, curious, and not the least bit intimidated by his streetwise charm. That very night, they were inseparable. No one could have known that this meeting over mugs of hot chocolate in a small Dallas home would ignite one of the most infamous partnerships in American history. But from that moment on, Clyde wasn't just running from the law, he was running with Bonnie Parker. Clyde didn't exactly ease into crime. By 19, he was already stealing cars, breaking into businesses, and generally testing the patience of every sheriff in Texas. Then, in early 1930, just weeks after meeting Bonnie, Clyde got himself arrested. Most people would have called it the end of a short-lived romance. Bonnie called it a challenge. While Clyde sat in a Dallas jail cell awaiting trial, Bonnie decided to up the ante. One day, she walked in for a visit, looking every bit the loyal sweetheart, but under her dress, she was hiding something, a revolver. She slipped it to Clyde, and within days, he used it to escape alongside a couple of other inmates. It was the kind of move that would have looked amazing in the papers, except Clyde got caught less than a week later in Ohio. So much for the perfect getaway. This time, there was no quick bail or clever trick. Clyde was sent to East Ham Prison Farm, one of the most brutal prisons in Texas. We're talking hard labor, chain gangs, and guards who made cruelty part of their daily schedule. Clyde went in a cocky kid and came out 2 years later as someone entirely different, meaner, harder, and fueled by a grudge so deep that he'd one day plan an armed assault on East Ham just to get revenge. Oh, and legend has it, he even arranged to have 2 of his toes chopped off just to get out of the brutal field labor, which, yeah, it technically worked, but it also meant he had a permanent limp for the rest of his life. By 1932, Clyde was free, thanks not to Bonnie's smuggling skills this time, but to his mother's pleading for parole. And when he reunited with Bonnie, it wasn't just love in the air. It was the beginning of a crime spree that would make them legends and public enemy number 1. When Clyde walked out of prison in 1932, he wasn't looking to go straight. He was looking for Bonnie. And when the 2 reunited, they didn't waste time with flowers or candlelit dinners. No, their idea of a date involved stolen cars, dodging police, and the occasional awkward diner robbery. Now here's the thing. Despite the movies making it seem like they were master bank robbers, Bonnie and Clyde actually started out robbing gas stations and small grocery stores. Why? Because robbing a bank in the middle of the Great Depression was like trying to rob a swimming pool in a drought. There was just not much cash inside. Most of their early heists barely covered rent, food, and a steady supply of ammunition. Sounds romantic, right? Bonnie wasn't exactly the getaway driver type. She didn't even know how to drive at first. And Clyde? Well, he was obsessed with Fords, particularly the V8 model, because it could outrun most police cars. In fact, he was so devoted to the Ford V8 that he once wrote Henry Ford a fan letter saying, and I quote, "I will steal nothing else but a Ford." No word on whether Ford wrote back, though. By this point, they were traveling with a rotating cast of outlaws, including Clyde's brother Buck and his wife Blanche, who sometimes spent more time bickering than actually committing crimes. They were like the Depression-era version of a dysfunctional road trip sitcom, except every pit stop ended with someone pointing a gun at a cashier. Still, their run-ins with the law were getting bolder, and the newspapers, well, they were eating it up. Reporters loved them, not for the money they stole, but for the image they sold. 2 young lovers on the run, living fast, dodging bullets, and thumbing their noses at authority. America was hooked, and Bonnie, she played into it, writing her now famous poetry about their exploits. One of her verses even predicted their violent deaths. Picture this, a dusty little Texas town in the middle of summer, 1932. Main Street is almost empty, except for the gas station at the corner, its single pump baking in the heat. A Ford V8, freshly stolen of course, rolls up. Bonnie's in the passenger seat, scanning the street like a hawk. Clyde steps out, dressed sharp, hair slicked back. A pistol, just visible in his hand. The target? A mom and pop shop attached to the gas station. Inside, the owner is behind the counter, counting the day's meager earnings, which, spoiler alert, it's really not much. Clyde walks in, calm, looks like he's about to buy a soda. Then, in one smooth motion, he points the pistol at the clerk and tells him to hand it over. No yelling, no wild threats. Clyde preferred speed over drama. The goal wasn't to terrorize, it was to be in and out before anyone could run to the phone. Bonnie? She stayed near the door, watching for trouble. Contrary to some of the wilder legends, she rarely fired anything during these small jobs. She liked the idea of being Clyde's partner in crime, but she wasn't exactly spraying bullets around every time they stopped for a stick-up. On a good day, they might walk away with $20, maybe $50. That's about $400 to $1,000 in today's money. But plenty of times, it was much less. In fact, there was a recorded case where Clyde robbed the store, got $2, and was so annoyed he stole a pack of cigarettes, just to feel like it was worth the trouble. Most of these early heists ended without anyone getting hurt. Not because they were saints. Clyde could be ruthless if he was cornered, and at this stage, he preferred to avoid violence unless the police showed up, and when they did, things turned quick. That would come later, though. Small-town stick-ups could only keep Bonnie and Clyde under the radar for so long. By late 1932, their jobs were getting riskier, their take-home cash wasn't improving, and their willingness to shoot their way out of trouble was starting to catch up with them. For all their careful planning and fast getaways, Bonnie and Clyde, they weren't untouchable. In 1932, not long after they started making headlines, Clyde and an accomplice, without Bonnie, robbed a general store. Things got messy, and the police were quickly on their trail. Clyde slipped away, but Bonnie, she wasn't so lucky. She was arrested in Kaufman, Texas, suspected of helping the gang in their crimes. At the time, the authorities thought she might be willing to spill everything she knew about Clyde. But Bonnie, she wasn't about to give the police the satisfaction. She kept her mouth shut, even when they questioned her for hours. But the thing is they didn't have much on her. She'd been left behind during a job gone wrong, and without hard evidence, all they could do was hold her for a few months on complicity in robbery. She spent time in jail reading, writing poetry, and no doubt imagining how Clyde was managing without her. When she was finally released in late 1932, she went right back to Clyde. No cooling off period, no second thoughts. Straight from jail to the passenger seat of another stolen Ford. It was as if the arrest had only made her more determined to see this thing to the end. When Bonnie walked out of that Texas jail in late 1932, she didn't return to a normal life. She didn't even go home to see her mother at first. Instead, she went straight back to Clyde, as if the time behind bars had just been a short intermission in their crime spree. The two hit the road again, pulling small jobs across Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. They weren't striking it rich, but they were making headlines, and every sheriff's department in the Southwest had their names on wanted posters. By early 1933, they'd teamed up with Clyde's brother Buck and his wife Blanche, plus a younger sidekick named W.D. This little band of misfits decided to lay low for a while, renting a quiet apartment over a garage in Missouri. To the neighbors, they were just a group of rowdy friends, but in reality, the quiet apartment was stocked with weapons, whiskey, and stolen goods. The partying, laughing, and occasional weapon cleaning sessions were loud enough that someone finally tipped off the police. And on April 13th, 1933, officers arrived to check things out. They expected to arrest a couple of small-time crooks without a fight. What they got was a full-blown battle. Clyde opened fire almost instantly, spraying bullets from an automatic rifle, the kind of weapon you don't expect to see outside a war zone. Bullets tore through the garage, officers scrambled for cover, and in the chaos, 2 policemen died. The gang escaped in a hail of gunfire, leaving behind a treasure trove for the police: stolen weapons, handwritten poems, and a roll of undeveloped film. When the pictures were published in newspapers across the country, Bonnie with a cigar in her teeth, Clyde aiming a rifle with a grin, the legend exploded. But these weren't random snapshots. They were staged, taken by the gang and left behind for the police to find, knowing the press would publish them. It was free publicity, and it made them look like charming rebels instead of desperate fugitives. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were America's favorite outlaws, whether the public approved or not. One thing about Bonnie and Clyde, they never seemed short on firepower. But here's the truth. They didn't buy their weapons at some shady back alley arms deal. Most of them came straight from the very people hunting them: law enforcement. Clyde had a habit of raiding small-town armories and National Guard stations, slipping in at night and helping himself to whatever was on the racks. It was during these raids that he scored his favorite weapon, the automatic rifle, or bar. It could punch through a car's engine block, and in Clyde's hands, it became the ultimate equalizer against pursuing the police. They also picked up plenty of revolvers, pistols, and shotguns from officers they ambushed or outmaneuvered. After the Joplin shootout, their collection was practically military grade, and they traveled light but lethal. A trunk full of guns, spare ammo belts, and occasionally a few grenades, for good measure, of course. If Bonnie and Clyde rolled into your town, they brought an armory with them. But what about their love life? That's where the legend and the truth get tangled. The Hollywood version paints them as an endlessly passionate couple, but life on the run isn't exactly candlelit dinners and long walks on the beach. Most of their dates happen in stolen cars, eating canned food by the roadside, or hiding out in cramped, dirty hideouts. Privacy was rare. Comfort was rarer. Still, their bond was real, and it was intense. Surrounded by danger, they clung to each other. Bonnie wrote poetry about their love, predicting they'd go down together. Clyde carried her photos with him like a talisman. But this wasn't a soft, gentle romance. It was a partnership forged in adrenaline, gunsmoke, and the constant hum of the getaway engine. At this stage, they weren't just in love. They were fused together by the knowledge that no one else on earth could possibly understand what it was like to live the way that they did. By mid-1933, Bonnie and Clyde were carrying enough firepower to arm a small militia, and they needed every bit of it. Law enforcement wasn't just chasing them anymore. They were closing in with shotguns, rifles, and orders to shoot first, ask questions later. The first big test came in Platte City, Missouri. The gang had rented 2 tourist cabins to lay low, thinking that they could just blend in. But a tip-off brought local law enforcement right to their doorstep, and before the cops could even knock, Clyde spotted them from a window, and within seconds, the quiet night exploded. Rounds ripped through walls, blasts tore into the cabin, and Bonnie and Clyde were firing from every opening that they could find. The police had to retreat, leaving the gang to grab their weapons, pile into their car, and blast out of town. before sunrise. Then came Dexter, Iowa, in July of 1933, a battle that almost ended the legend for good. By this point, Bonnie was badly burned from a car accident weeks earlier, her legs wrapped in bandages. She couldn't move quickly, so Clyde and the others had to carry her when they changed hideouts, but that didn't mean she was out of the fight. Police surrounded their hideout on a farm outside Dexter. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, echoing across the cornfields. Clyde and WD unleashed the bars, mowing down fence posts and keeping the officers pinned. Buck Barrow, Clyde's brother, was shot in the head, but somehow kept firing. Blanche, Buck's wife, was blinded in one eye by flying glass. Through it all, Clyde kept glancing at Bonnie, making sure she was out of the line of fire, making sure she was still alive. The gang escaped yet again, but barely. Buck's injuries were fatal. Blanche was captured. And for Bonnie and Clyde, the near loss of their closest family in the gang was a grim reminder. The net was tightening, and the people around them were paying the price. By 1934, Bonnie and Clyde, they were running out of road. The Platte City and Dexter shootouts had gutted the Barrow gang. Buck was gone, Blanche was in custody, and WD had gone his own way. Now it was mostly just the two of them, plus the occasional desperate recruit. And everywhere they went, the law was only a few miles behind them. The Texas prison system was still at the top of Clyde's enemy list. Earlier that year, he orchestrated the daring East Ham prison breakout, freeing several inmates, including his old partner Raymond. It was a bold move, and it worked, but it was also the last straw for law enforcement. The Texas Department of Corrections brought in retired Ranger Frank Hamer, a man whose idea of diplomacy was a loaded rifle, and gave him one mission: hunt down Bonnie and Clyde. From that moment, the manhunt went from scattered and uncoordinated to cold, methodical, and ruthless. Hamer studied their movements, figuring out that they followed a predictable loop across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, stopping to visit friends or family safe houses. The trick wasn't finding them once. It was predicting where they'd be next. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde's lives on the run were far from glamorous. They slept in stolen cars, ate whatever they could scrounge, and were constantly nursing injuries. Bonnie's legs never fully healed from the 1933 crash, and Clyde had a permanent limp from his prison days. Still, they clung to each other, joking between close calls, singing along to the radio when they thought they were in the clear. But both of them knew, deep down, that the road was narrowing. And by the spring of 1934, the legend of Bonnie and Clyde was still alive, but their days were numbered. The police were closing the loop, and when they caught up to them, there would be no more escapes. May 23, 1934, a rural road outside Gippsland, Louisiana. The sun had barely risen when Bonnie and Clyde's stolen Ford V8 rolled down the dirt stretch. They thought they were meeting a friend, but in reality, they were driving straight into a trap. Frank Hamer and his posse had been waiting all night, hidden in the trees and the brush, rifles ready. They've gotten word from an informant that Bonnie and Clyde would be coming this way, and they weren't taking any chances. This wasn't an arrest mission. This was an execution. The Ford appeared in the distance, dust rising from its tires. Clyde was behind the wheel, Bonnie beside him, dressed in a red dress. No police lights, no warning shots, just the sudden roar of gunfire. Bars, shotguns, and pistols all at once. More than 130 rounds, in under 20 seconds. The car shuddered, glass exploded, and the engine screamed before dying in the middle of the road. When the shooting stopped, the silence was deafening. Bonnie slumped forward, a spray of flowers from her lap spilling onto the floorboard. Clyde was motionless, his hand still on the wheel. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde had ended in a cloud of smoke and dust. Not with a last stand, but with a ruthless, one-sided ambush. Within hours, crowds swarmed the scene, tearing pieces from the car, locks of hair, even fragments of clothing, souvenirs of America's most infamous outlaw couple. To the law, they were finally just two criminals off the road, but to the public, they were something stranger, part romance, part rebellion, part tragedy. And whether you saw them as heroes or villains, one thing was certain. Bonnie and Clyde's ride, well, it was over. The ambush of Bonnie and Clyde might have ended their lives, but it was only the beginning of the frenzy. When the shooting stopped, Hamer and his men barely had time to process what they'd done. Before the world descended on that lonely Louisiana road, the crime scene was never blocked off. There were no barricades, no controlled perimeter. Instead, locals rushed in, followed by reporters, souvenir hunters, and anyone curious enough to drive out. Within minutes, hundreds of people surrounded the bullet-riddled Ford. It was complete chaos. Onlookers tore at the car like vultures, cutting away Bonnie's dress, pulling Clyde's bloody hair, even dipping handkerchiefs in their blood as keepsakes. One man tried to cut off Clyde's ear. Another attempted to steal his trigger finger. Law enforcement couldn't contain the mob. They had unleashed a legend, and now the legend belonged to the public. Their bodies were separated and returned to Texas. Despite their wishes to be buried side by side, Bonnie's strict mother, she refused. Bonnie Parker's funeral was held in Dallas, and more than 20,000 mourners turned out. Crowds packed the streets so tightly that it became one of the largest gatherings in Dallas history. Bonnie's body was dressed in a blue silk dress, her coffin piled high with flowers, some from admirers, others from strangers who'd never met her but felt they knew her through the headlines and the photographs. Clyde's funeral was no less dramatic. His service drew about 15,000 people, and his family buried him at Western Heights Cemetery. His tombstone simply read, "Gone but not forgotten." Clyde's casket was displayed at a Dallas funeral home, and so many people came to see him that the funeral director had to set up police to manage the line. Some visitors came out of morbid curiosity, others out of admiration, proof that even in death, Clyde had an audience. The two of them had dreamed of being together forever, and in life, they were inseparable. In death, they lay in separate cemeteries, Bonnie with her family and Clyde with his. But the sheer number of mourners at their funerals showed something strange and uniquely American. Bonnie and Clyde might have been outlaws, but they had become folk heroes, immortalized in the public imagination the moment those bullets tore through their car. Bonnie and Clyde's story didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why two young Texans would risk everything in a life of crime, you have to step back and look at the world they were born into. America in the 1930s was a country on its knees. The Great Depression wasn't just about stock markets crashing on Wall Street. It was about families losing everything. Banks failed overnight, wiping out life savings. Farmers watched their crops wither in the Dust Bowl, and the soil itself turning against them. In cities, men stood in endless breadlines, waiting hours for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread just to get them through the day. Women sold their wedding rings just to buy flour. Children went hungry. For millions, survival was a daily negotiation. And this desperation bred resentment. People felt abandoned by the system, by the bankers, by the politicians, by the wealthy who seemed to weather the storm, while ordinary folks were crushed beneath it. In that atmosphere, it's really not hard to see how figures like Bonnie and Clyde could capture the public's imagination. They weren't just robbing banks and grocery stores. To many, they were robbing the very institutions that had betrayed the common man. And that's the strange paradox of their fame. Bonnie and Clyde weren't Robin Hood. They didn't hand out their loot to the poor, but their defiance made them symbols. In a time when so many Americans felt powerless, here were two nobodies from Texas making headlines, outsmarting police and living fast while the rest of the country was stuck, waiting for their next meal. To understand Bonnie and Clyde, you have to understand the world that shaped them, the Great Depression. It was more than just an economic downturn. It was a nationwide collapse of trust, opportunity, and hope. It began with the stock market crash of 1929. Overnight, billions of dollars in wealth evaporated. But the real damage wasn't done on Wall Street. It was done in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, where ordinary families suddenly found themselves jobless, homeless, and penniless. Banks closed their doors with no warning, and when depositors begged for their life savings, they were told the money was just gone. Imagine working your whole life only to be handed nothing but a locked door and a broken promise. In cities, unemployment, it soared. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 Americans were out of work. Men lined up for blocks outside soup kitchens, their hats pulled low, their pride swallowed. Families moved into makeshift shanty towns, named Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. Meanwhile, crime rates ticked upward, petty theft, robberies, anything that could put food on the table. People weren't dreaming about getting rich. They were dreaming about getting by. And then there was the Dust Bowl, an ecological disaster layered on top of the economic one. Years of overfarming, combined with severe drought, turned huge stretches of farmland into dust. Entire towns were swallowed by choking clouds of dirt. Farmers loaded what little they had onto trucks and headed west, searching for work, for dignity, for survival. And you guys, they rarely found it. In a world like this, distrust festered. Ordinary people didn't see banks as places of safety. They saw them as thieves in nice suits. They didn't see the law as justice. They saw it as protection for the wealthy. And into this anger and despair stepped Bonnie and Clyde, two young, desperate Texans who didn't just suffer through the Depression. They decided to fight in the only way that they knew how, with stolen cars, stolen weapons, and stolen time. Out of the hunger, the dust, and the endless waiting lines, Bonnie and Clyde became something more than just two outlaws. They became symbols, and the newspapers made sure of it. Every time the gang pulled off a robbery or slipped through a police dragnet, reporters rushed to print the story. They didn't just describe the crimes. They added flair. Bonnie was painted as a cigar-smoking gun mole, the dangerous beauty who laughed at authority. Clyde was cast as the daring bandit, too slick for the cops to catch. Even their getaway cars were described with admiration, as though they were racehorses outrunning the law. Readers, they ate it up. For some, Bonnie and Clyde were villains, killers, who left officers and bystanders dead in their wake. But for others, they were folk heroes. People who struck back at the very system that had left so many families broke and broken. Bankers had taken their homes. Politicians had offered little relief. And here were two nobodies thumbing their noses at both. No, Bonnie and Clyde didn't hand out stolen money to the poor, but their rebellion spoke to a deeper desire, the wish that someone, anyone, might finally get away with defying the odds. The irony, of course, is that their fame made them far easier to find. Their faces were plastered on wanted posters, their photographs circulated nationwide, and their names became household words. Bonnie and Clyde weren't just living on the edge anymore. They were living under a spotlight, and the brighter that spotlight burned, the shorter their time on the run could be. But the Great Depression didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of years of pressure building under the surface until everything finally cracked. To understand Bonnie and Clyde's world, we have to understand what caused the collapse that shaped it. And it all began on Wall Street. Throughout the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, the American economy, it looked unstoppable. People were buying cars, radios, refrigerators, and even homes on credit. Banks encouraged risky investments, and ordinary Americans began pouring money into the stock market. Why? Because stock prices kept going up. It felt safe. It felt easy. It felt like a ticket to wealth. But by the late 1929, the market was bloated. Stocks were wildly overpriced compared to the actual value of companies. When confidence wavered, panic set in. On October 29, 1929, known forever as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed. Billions of dollars in wealth were wiped out overnight. But the crash itself wasn't the sole cause of the depression. It was just the trigger. America's banks were fragile. There were thousands of small local banks, many of which had very little cash on hand. When the market crashed, people rushed to withdraw their savings. Banks didn't have enough to cover the demand, and one by one, they failed. Between 1929 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks collapsed. Families lost everything. No insurance, no refunds, just gone. This destroyed trust in the banking system and left millions with no safety net. Even before the crash, America was making more than it could sell. Factories were pumping out cars, clothes, radios, but wages hadn't kept up with the cost of living. Ordinary families couldn't afford to keep buying, and farmers, they had the same problem. They grew bumper crops, but the prices were so low they couldn't even cover their debts. So while shelves were full, stomachs were empty, a cruel paradox of abundance without access. The prosperity of the 1920s wasn't shared equally. A small percentage of Americans controlled most of the wealth, while the majority lived paycheck to paycheck. When the crash came, the wealthy lost fortunes, but they had reserves. Working-class families had nothing to fall back on. The entire middle and lower classes were left stranded. And remember, America wasn't alone. After World War I, European countries owed massive debts to the U.S. They were already struggling, and when the American economy tanked, it dragged the rest of the world with it. International trade collapsed, unemployment soared everywhere, and the Depression, well, it became a global crisis. So when we think of Bonnie and Clyde, we can't just see two reckless criminals. We have to see the storm that they were born into, a system where banks had failed, jobs had vanished, and the future looked hopeless. For many, the law no longer seemed like justice, and when the system breaks down that badly, people start looking at outlaws not just with fear, but with fascination. The Great Depression wasn't just about numbers and statistics. It was about people, millions of them, suddenly realizing that the world they thought they could trust had collapsed overnight. Banks had taken their savings, factories had closed their doors, farms had turned to dust, and all the while, politicians offered promises that felt too small, too late. So when stories of Bonnie and Clyde hit the newspapers, they landed in a world starved for something, anything, that looked like defiance. Here were two kids from Texas who had nothing, just like everyone else. But instead of waiting in bread lines, they stole cars, robbed stores, and they outsmarted the police. They weren't giving out handouts, they weren't Robin Hood, but they were living a fantasy that most Americans stuck in poverty could only dream of. To the police, they were criminals. To the families who'd lost loved ones in their robberies, they were killers. But to the farmer who just lost his land to the bank, or the factory worker who hadn't had a paycheck in months, Bonnie and Clyde were something else, symbols. Symbols of rebellion, of freedom, of a kind of power ordinary people no longer have. Even their photographs, Bonnie grinning with a cigar, Clyde cocky with a rifle, looked like a slap in the face to authority, a message. If the system was broken, then maybe breaking the rules wasn't so wrong. And that's the paradox of Bonnie and Clyde. They were both feared and admired, hunted and idolized. Their crimes were real, their victims were real. But so was the myth, and in the desperate world of the Great Depression, the myth mattered just as much as the truth. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde were just two kids from Texas, ordinary children of the Great Depression who might have lived ordinary lives, if not for the desperation of their times and the choices they had made chasing freedom on the open road. They weren't masterminds, they weren't Robin Hood. Most of their robberies brought in little more than pocket change. They left chaos behind them, bullet holes, grieving families, and a trail of stolen cars. And yet, their names endure. Why? Because Bonnie and Clyde were more than what they did. They were what they represented. In a world where banks had betrayed their customers, where farms had dried into dust, and where millions stood in breadlines, Bonnie and Clyde, they flipped the script. They didn't play by the rules of a rigged game. They burned the rule book and lived fast in a world that offered no future. Their photographs told the story better than words. Bonnie, playful with a pistol, Clyde, smirking with his arm around her. They weren't just criminals, they were an image, an idea, a love story written in smoke and gunpowder. And maybe that's why they've lingered in our imagination, because in every era, people dream of escape, of living outside the suffocating weight of rules and debts and expectations. Bonnie and Clyde lived that fantasy, but it came at the highest possible cost. Their ride ended not in glory, but in an ambush, their bodies riddled with bullets, their car torn apart by souvenir hunters. They were buried separately, denied even in death the thing they wanted the most, to be together. But here's the truth that makes their story haunting. Bonnie and Clyde were never invincible. They were never larger than life. They were two young lovers in over their heads, caught between poverty and the promise of something bigger, something brighter. And yet, in dying young, they achieved something they never could in life: immortality. Their story outlived them, becoming legend, becoming myth. So when we talk about Bonnie and Clyde, we're not just talking about bank robbers. We're talking about the strange power of myth in desperate times. We're talking about how love and rebellion can twist together until they're inseparable. And we're talking about how sometimes the most reckless lives are the ones we remember the longest. Because Bonnie and Clyde didn't just live through the Great Depression, they became its most famous outlaws. And nearly a century later, their names still ride on. Alright, you guys, that's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Also comment if there are any topics you'd like me to cover next. Good night. See you later.